What's up everybody, Alex here from Red Hot MTG. Today I got my first deck tech and full length video of the channel for you, and today we're going to be talking about Grenzo Dungeon Warden. Grenzo is a 2/2 Goblin Rogue for red, black, and X, and it has the ability that Grenzo enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and pay 2. Put the bottom card of your library into your graveyard. If it's a creature with power less than or equal to Grenzo's power, put it onto the battlefield. Now my build for this deck I call Chaos Goblin Tribal. What I mean by that is that most Grenzo decks have some sort of bottom deck manipulation, so they know what they are getting almost every time they activate Grenzo. In my build, we don't waste resources setting up the bottom of the deck, and instead build it to hit a creature roughly 3 out of 5 activations by running 57 creatures. This is by far my favorite deck to play because the synergy between goblins keeps the deck relatively powerful, while being a slightly different playing experience every time you play due to the random nature of Grenzo's ability without any bottom deck manipulation. So with all of that being said, let's get into the first category of cards. To start off, we have Goblin Instigator and Mogwai Marshal, both of which are 1/1 goblins for 2 mana that bring in a 1/1 goblin token when they enter the battlefield. Mogwai Marshal also leaves behind another goblin token when he leaves and has an echo cost of 2. Next up, we have Beetleback Chief, Slinggang Lieutenant, and Marsh Flitter, which each cost 4 mana and bring 2 1/1 goblin tokens when they enter the battlefield. Marsh Flitter is not a goblin itself, unfortunately, but we want as many goblin bodies on the field as we can, so she's still a great include. Also, Marsh Flitter and Slinggang Lieutenant both have free sack outlets on them, which are always good to have in decks to get extra value out of your bodies, especially with some of the other cards we will be talking about later. Now, Slinggang Lieutenant is one of the best cards in the deck because sacrificing a goblin for 1 damage to any player and you gaining 1 life may not seem like much, but we rely heavily on any incidental damage we can do, and it can sometimes just kill a player out of nowhere. Then we have Siege Gang Commander, who costs 5 but brings 3 1/1 goblins with him when he enters the battlefield. He also has the activated ability to pay 2 and sacrifice a goblin to deal 2 damage to target creature or player. I honestly don't find myself activating his ability very often because 2 mana for that effect is pretty steep for this deck, but it can really help remove pesky creatures your opponents might have if you need to in a pinch. Next, we have Goblin Rabblemaster and Legion Warboss, both of which are 2/2 goblins for 3 mana. Goblin Rabblemaster says, other goblins you control attack each turn of Fable. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 goblin creature token with haste onto the battlefield, and whenever Goblin Rabblemaster attacks, it gets +1/+0 for each other attacking goblin. Legion Warboss has Mentor, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 goblin creature token. That token gains haste and attacks as combat of Fable. These cards are great because the ability to create a goblin token with haste every combat is exactly what this deck wants, and Rabblemaster can also swing for huge damage when you have a big field amassed, and Legion Warboss can pump all of your smaller bodies with his Mentor effect. And to finish this category out, we have the 2 goblin generating powerhouses, Krinko Mob Boss and Krinko 10th Street Kingpin. Mob Boss taps to create a goblin token for each goblin we have on the battlefield, and 10th Street Kingpin gets a +1/+1 counter every time he attacks and then makes goblin tokens equal to his power. These two can create an absurd amount of goblin tokens throughout a game and will definitely have a target on their back as soon as they hit the field, so hopefully you have a haste enabler to use them as soon as they come out. First up in this category, we got Goblin Chieftain, Goblin King, Mad Auntie, Goblin Trashmaster, and Judith the Scourge Diva. Goblin Chieftain costs 3 and grants +1/+1 in haste to all of our other goblins. Goblin King costs 3 and grants +1/+1 in Mountain Walk to them. Mad Auntie costs 3 and grants +1/+1 and also has tap regenerate target goblin. Goblin Trashmaster costs 4 and grants +1/+1 to our goblin team, and we can also sacrifice a goblin to destroy an artifact. And finally, Judith, who is not a goblin herself, but she costs 3 and grants +1/+1 to all of our other creatures, and whenever a non-token creature dies, she deals 1 damage to any target. These lords are very important to the deck because all of our creatures are very low powered by themselves and can become serious threats with any of these out, and they each provide extra utility that strengthens our game plan. And lastly, we have some pseudo lords that don't offer any stat boosts to our team, but they do reduce their mana or give them extra abilities. So Frog Tosser, Banneret, and Goblin War Chief each reduce all of our goblins by 1 generic mana, and War Chief also gives all of them haste. Caterwauling Boggart says each of our goblins cannot be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. So the effects of each of these cards are still very powerful in this deck. This next category is one of the reasons why goblins can be so powerful, because each of these cards can cheat other goblins into play. So to start off, we have Goblin Lackey and Warden Instigator. Each say you can put a goblin from your hand into play when they deal combat damage to a player, and Warden Instigator also has double strike. Next we have Mog Catcher and Goblin Wizard. Mog Catcher is a 2/2 mercenary for 4 that has pay 3 and tap to search your library for a goblin card and put it directly into play. Goblin Wizard has tap, put a goblin from your hand into play, and you can also pay red to give a goblin protection from white until end of turn, which isn't needed that often but can sometimes be very good at getting damage through to a white player or protecting your goblins from white based targeted removal. Now, this card is on the reserve list, and this deck build is certainly not a budget one, but this card specifically has jumped in price recently and may be out of reach for a lot of players, so you could consider replacing it with some honorable mentions that I will talk about at the end of this video. And lastly, we have Junk Troller. This is not a goblin, but it has tap, put target card in a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. This doesn't have any generic synergies with goblins or cheating them into play, but it works great with our commander's ability and can help us reuse the powerful goblins that die throughout the game for no mana investment. At the beginning of this video, I did say that we don't want to waste our resources setting up the bottom of our deck, but this ability is on a creature with power less than Grenzo, which means we can get this card off of a Grenzo activation, unlike many other non-creature spells that would perform a similar role, so it is a perfect fit. In this category, we have 3 1-drop goblins with Goblin Bushwhacker, Frenzied Goblin, and Legion Loyalist. All of these cards help us in combat because Bushwhacker grants +1/+0 and haste to all of our other creatures if it was kicked. Frenzied Goblin can prevent our opponents from being able to attack with a creature, and Legion Loyalist grants first strike, trample, and can't be blocked by creature tokens to all of our attacking team if at least 3 other creatures attack with it. Combat is the main win condition for this deck, so cards like these can be very powerful. First up in this section, we have Zozu the Punisher and Brash Taunter. Zozu has, whenever a land enters the battlefield, Zozu deals 2 damage to that land's controller. This can be a brutal effect, especially if you can drop it early when other decks are trying to ramp. And while it does affect us as well, you typically aren't going to have as many lands coming into play as other decks will. Brash Taunter has Indestructible, and whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any opponent. With the activated ability of 2 red and tap, Brash Taunter fights target creature. This is a great blocker and can dish out some big damage if your opponents are playing big creatures, or if they are using burn-based board wipes like Blasphemous Act. Then we have Chain Whirler and Hellrider. Chain Whirler has first strike, and whenever it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. Like I said before, the incidental damage in this deck will add up, and this can also wipe away some of our opponent's smaller utility creatures and tokens when it comes into play. Then Hellrider is a 3/3 devil for 4 that has haste, and whenever a creature you control attacks, Hellrider deals 1 damage to the defending player, attacking exactly what we want to be doing every turn in this deck, so getting extra damage in with each of our attacks is great. Next, we have Pashlik Mons and Goblin Sharpshooter. Pashlik Mons is a 2/2 for 3 and has whenever it or another goblin you control dies, it deals 1 damage to any target and has the activated ability of 3 red and sacrifice a goblin to put 2 1/1 goblins into play. If you combo this with a free sack outlet, you'll usually be able to kill any of the small to medium sized creatures your opponents have with relative ease, but you can also threaten a lot of damage to the player who wants to board wipe when you've built up our field. Then, Goblin Sharpshooter is a 1/1 for 3 and has Goblin Sharpshooter doesn't untap during your untap step. Whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, untap Goblin Sharpshooter. And tap, deal 1 damage to any target. This is probably the best card in the deck because we would be having a lot of creatures die throughout the game, and it also counts all of our opponent's creatures dying. It also has the flexibility to act as spot removal for our opponent's creatures when we need it, or it can be burned to the face when we want to get that extra damage in. All right, and here we have Skirk Fire Marshal, a 5-drop 2/2 goblin that has protection from red and tap 5 untapped goblins you control. Skirk Fire Marshal deals 10 damage to each creature and player. This card has won me multiple games because it's not unlikely to have 10 or more goblins out on the field, and we can tap 5 goblins to activate this ability, hold priority, and then tap another 5 or more to activate it again. Now, we will be taking all of this damage as well, but in my experience, we will usually have one of the higher life totals at the table, since we should always have blockers available and be doing most of the combat during a game. This one card can put out an absurd amount of damage, and our opponents will have to be very careful about committing to the board as long as we have it on the field. And lastly, we have another non-goblin creature with Torbrand Thane of Redfell. Torbrand is a 2/4 Dwarf Noble for 4 and has if a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. As you'll see in the stats section at the end of this video, most of our deck is red, and the extra damage that Torbrand can help our deck dish out can be very high. First off, we have Goblin Ringleader, Sensation Gorger, Species Specialist, and Rick's Mighty Guildmage. Goblin Ringleader is a 2/2 for 4 and has whenever it enters the battlefield, reveal the top 4 cards of your library and put all goblins revealed this way into your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library. Usually this will get you at least one goblin off the top, but has a high ceiling of being able to get you up to 4 cards sometimes. Sensation Gorger is a 2/2 for 3 and has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature that shares a creature type with Sensation Gorger, you may reveal it, and if you do, each player discards their hand and draws 4 cards. Usually aggro decks play their hands out fast, and this can be a great way at drawing you back up to 4 when you need it, but it can also hurt our opponents because they only draw back up to 4 after this wheel, which is a lot less than the 7 that most wheel effects usually let players draw. Species Specialist is a great card in a tribal deck with black because when it enters the battlefield, we can pick a creature type, in this case goblins, and whenever a creature of that type dies, we draw a card. Rick's Mighty Reveler lets us discard a card and draw a card if it comes into play normally, but also has the flexibility to pay its spectacle cost to discard our hand and draw 3 if we need to. Next up, we have Conspicuous Snoop and Wart Boggart Auntie. Conspicuous Snoop has play with the top card of your library revealed. You may cast goblin creatures from the top of your library, and as long as the top card of your library is a goblin, Conspicuous Snoop has all activated abilities of that card. Wart has Fear, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return a goblin from your graveyard to your hand. Getting some of the powerful goblins we've had die during a game is a great form of card advantage. To start, we have Goblin Matron and Imperial Recruiter. Goblin Matron is a 1/1 goblin for 3 that lets us search our library for a goblin card and put it into our hand when she comes into play. Imperial Recruiter is a 1/1 human advisor for 3 that lets us find any creature with power 2 or less in our deck and put it into our hand. Most of the creatures in our deck definitely meet that requirement, so it can be almost as efficient as Goblin Matron. And lastly, we have a crazy goblin card with Goblin Recruiter. It is a 1/1 for 2 that has whenever it enters the battlefield, search your library for any number of goblin cards, reveal them, and put them on top of your library in any order. Usually when this comes down, I'll go and find Goblin Ringleader, and then 4 other high value goblins that I can draw as soon as I play Goblin Ringleader. Just be careful about stacking too many creatures on top of your deck and diluting your chances of hitting a creature with Grenzo's ability. Also, if you don't plan your draws out perfectly and the board state changes, you could be in a bad situation where you're guaranteed not to draw what you need in the moment. Still an awesome goblin though. First we have Munitions Expert and Ravenous Chupacabra. Munitions Expert deals damage to any creature or planeswalker equal to the number of goblins you have on the field when it enters the battlefield, and Ravenous Chupacabra destroys any creature an opponent controls when it comes into play. Then we have Tuk Tuk Scrapper and Ingot Chewer, both of which destroy an artifact when they come into play. And lastly, we have Goblin Crater Maker, which we can pay 1 and sacrifice to deal 2 damage to a creature or destroy target colorless non-land permanent. In this section, we have some utility creatures that I didn't put into the other categories, and to start things off, we have Goblin Chirurgeon, Skirk Prospector, and Priest of Forgotten Gods. Each of these cards allows us to sacrifice our goblins for extra value. And then we have Goblin Piledriver, Grenzo Havoc Raiser, and Kiki-Jiki Mirrorbreaker. Goblin Piledriver is just a big beater when we have a sizable field. Havoc Raiser can give us some impulse draw or goad our opponent's creatures when he attacks. And then Kiki-Jiki can tap and create a copy of any non-legendary creature we control until the end of turn. This is probably the second best card in the deck because copying a lot of our goblins with good enter the battlefield effects can generate so much value throughout the game, but it can also copy cards that could help us win on the spot. And to end this section, we have a couple non-goblin utility creatures with Phyrexian Delver, Solemn Simulacrum, and Zealous Conscripts. Phyrexian Delver can reanimate one of our creatures when it enters the battlefield. Solemn Simulacrum gets us a basic land when it comes into play, and then draws us a card when it dies. And then Zealous Conscripts can steal a creature until end of turn and give it haste. Zealous Conscripts is a good red creature on its own, but if we have Kiki-Jiki on the battlefield, you can actually make infinite copies of Zealous Conscripts and swing with all of them, which will most likely win you the game. I've never actually won with that combo in this deck, but it's definitely worth having since both creatures are just good on their own. Now, We mainly focus on creatures in this deck, but there are a couple non-creature spells that are just too powerful not to include. And to start off, there is Soul Ring. This is pretty much an auto-include in any EDH deck, and this one is no different because it's just so powerful and efficient. I will say though that this is one of the cards in the deck that I could be convinced to replace for another creature. Then we have Heartstone, Fires of Invention, Mana Echoes, and Sword of Feast and Famine. All of the cards in this category are here because they do one thing: help us activate Grenzo's ability more. Heartstone reduces all activation costs by 1, and with Grenzo being able to pay 1 for each activation can mean we can get a crazy amount of creatures on the field out of nowhere. Fires of Invention says we can only cast 2 spells per turn and only during our turn, but lets us play our 2 spells for free if they cost less than the amount of lands we have in play. In most decks, this downside is too high to play this card, but we generally have no instant speed stuff in our hands to play anyways, and it lets us use all of our mana per turn to dump into Grince's ability while still letting us play 2 things from our hand for free if we need to. Mana Echoes has whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you may add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool for each creature you control that shares a creature type with it. If you have a critical mass of goblins on your field when this comes into play, you can pretty much win the game because you'll be adding so much mana every time a goblin comes into play that you can activate Grenzo until you hit every single creature in your deck. Then, Sword of Feast and Famine is just a crazy good equipment that grants +2/+2 in protection from black and green, and whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to an opponent, that player discards a card and you untap all of your lands. Doubling your mana in any deck is really powerful, but we can generally always use this extra mana by dumping it into Grenzo's ability. Now, this is an aggro deck and pretty reliant on a quick start to perform well, so we want all of our lands to come into play untapped. So to start things off, I run 2 red fetch lands with Wooded Foothills and Bloodstained Mire. Then I run 7 lands that tap for both of our colors that always or a majority of the time will come into play untapped with Blood Crypt, Dragonskull Summit, Luxury Suite, Auntie's Hovel, Foreboding Ruins, Smoldering Marsh, and Sulphurous Springs. Next are 2 lands that tap for both of our colors when we put a mana into them, with Graven Cairns and Shadowblood Ridge. Then we run Command Tower, Reflecting Pool, Exotic Orchard, and Unclaimed Territory, which can tap for any color. Some lands that tap for only one of our colors, with Castle Embereth, Blight Step Pathway, Seer Step Pathway, and Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. I know this can tap for anything we have devotion to, but in this deck we will generally only ever tap it for red mana, and sometimes that can be a lot of red mana. And then to finish the list off, we have 13 basic mountains and 3 basic swamps. So here are some honorable mentions for the deck. To start off, we have Muxus Goblin Grandee. Now I love this card, but I don't play it strictly because it costs 6 mana to play from our hand and has 4 power. All of the other creatures in the deck have power 3 or less because that is what Grenzo's power will reasonably be, and we want to make sure that we can play every creature we hit off of his ability. So even though this is a super powerful goblin, it can end up being a dead card we can't utilize too often. Now, after that, there are many Goblin and Goblin Synergy cards that you could run in your build, but here are a couple that I thought I'd point out. Boggart Harbinger, Dockside Extortionist, Wart Eye Witch, and Cabal Slaver. Boggart Harbinger is the least powerful of the tutors that I run in my opinion, and I didn't want too many tutors to be in the deck. Then Dockside Extortionist would be an amazing card in this deck, and the simple answer for why I don't run it is because that I haven't picked up a copy yet. Wart Eye Witch is another pretty powerful and synergistic card with Grenzo, but I kind of just forgot about it. And then Cabal Slaver can be a very powerful and brutal card in any Rakdos Goblin deck strategy, but the saltiness level of this card is very high, and I typically like my opponents to enjoy their time as well. And now for some non-creature cards. Goblin Bombardment, Skull Clamp, and Tel'Jalad Stylus. You'll probably see all of these in most Grenzo Goblin decks, and I did have them in my original build, but as I slowly optimized it to the strategy that I described today, they were cut to make room for more creatures. Alright, and now that we've gone over the whole deck, I'll give some deck statistics and talk about how it plays. First off, this chart shows our mana value curve and our spread of colors. The highest mana value in the deck is 5, and that is very intentional because anything higher than that we risk not being able to play when it's in our hand. And as I mentioned earlier, most of this deck is red, with 45 red spells and only 8 black ones. This next chart shows the proportions of card types we have in the deck, the highest category by far being creatures, coming in at 58 when we include our commander. So this deck plays like most aggro goblin decks, but I think it stands out above the rest because the card advantage that Grenzo offers. When we hit a creature off the bottom of our library and cheat it into play, that is a form of card advantage. And having this option also gives the deck a little more resiliency to board wipes that most other goblin decks suffer from, because with only a few Grenzo activations we can amass another board state relatively easily. I generally cast Grenzo on turn 2 every game where X is equal to 0, because you're going to want to start activating him as soon as possible and start generating that card advantage. Sometimes it can be hard to decide if you want to play cards from your hand or activate Grenzo's ability, and generally I'd say prioritize Grenzo's ability if you have a decent board state, because you usually don't know what you'll hit off the bottom and you can use the cards in your hand when they work best on another given board state. A typical play pattern for this deck when I play would be to swing with whatever I can on my turn and not cast anything. Then pass the turn and activate Grinzo's ability as many times as I can on the end step of the turn before it gets back to me. Playing this way can sometimes win out of nowhere too if you get some really strong goblins your opponents wouldn't have known about. Alright, so that's everything that I have on Grenzo Dungeon Warden. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing to help me out while I'm starting to build the channel, and comment down below what you liked and didn't like about it so that I can continuously improve, or if you have any questions. I have a lot more deck techs, box openings, and some pack opening shorts on the way soon. So thanks again, and see you in the next one.
Anytime.